All she wanted was to sketch in peace, but she ended up unearthing the deepest pain of his life. The watch on his wrist wasn't just an accessory, it was living proof of a devastating lie. And in that moment, the cold-hearted millionaire began to truly feel for the very first time. If this story has you hooked, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to it. The house was enormous, but the silence that inhabited every room seemed even larger. In the gardens of the Upper East Side, an affluent New York City neighborhood where imposing townhouses rose behind high walls and electronic gates, that particular residence stood out not for its ostentation, but for the coldness that emanated from its hallways. Ethan Hayes, at 43, lived there alone. Truly alone, because even when there were people around, he remained isolated within himself, as if he had built an invisible fortress where no one could enter. From a very young age, Ethan had learned not to trust anyone. His father, Anthony Hayes, had been a successful businessman, respected in the financial circles of the city. He had died young, leaving his only son a considerable fortune and a legacy of responsibility that weighed on him like an anchor. His mother, Beatrice, survived her husband by a few years, but never recovered from the loss. She spent her days in silence, staring into space, until her heart also gave up beating. Ethan was only 25 when he found himself completely alone, the heir to a financial empire he hadn't asked for, and a loneliness he didn't know how to name. In the years that followed, he transformed into the man he believed he should be, controlled, meticulous, impeccable. He woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning, followed an exercise routine that included a run on the treadmill and functional training, had a breakfast strictly measured in calories and nutrients, and by 7 o'clock he was already in front of his computer, answering emails, analyzing reports, making decisions that moved millions. His business meetings were conducted with surgical precision. He listened, calculated, decided. He rarely smiled. When he did, it was a mechanical gesture, devoid of warmth. The people around him respected him, but no one really knew him. His employees treated him with a mix of admiration and fear. They knew he was fair, that he paid well, that he kept his promises, but they also knew there was no room for intimacy. Ethan didn't go to parties, had no close friends, and didn't get involved in romances that lasted more than a few weeks. Whenever a woman tried to get close, he would build even higher walls, make excuses, and disappear. He didn't know how to let himself go, and perhaps he didn't even want to know. The house was a perfect reflection of who he was. Everything was organized, clean, perfect. The furniture was minimalist in design, with straight lines and neutral colors. There were no photos on the walls, no plants, nothing to indicate that someone actually lived there. It was more of a showroom than a home. Ethan liked it that way. The order calmed him. The emptiness protected him. But in some hidden corner of his soul, something ached. It was a dull, constant ache that he had learned to ignore. In the rare moments when this pain surfaced, usually late at night when exhaustion lowered his defenses, Ethan would find himself staring at the bedroom ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. If life was just numbers, contracts, meetings, and loneliness. But he would quickly push those thoughts away. Weakness had no place in his routine. It was on a Tuesday morning, an ordinary day like any other, that everything began to change. Ethan was in his office, a large room on the second floor of the house with a prime view of the garden, when he heard voices coming from downstairs. It was cleaning day, the long time. Housekeeper had retired a few weeks earlier, and the housekeeping agency had sent a new professional. Ethan had barely paid attention to her name during the interview. He hired her because she had good references and seemed efficient. That was enough. But that morning, besides the new cleaner's voice, there was another one, high-pitched, childish. Ethan frowned. He wasn't used to having children in the house. He rose from his chair and descended the stairs with firm steps, ready to make it clear that this was not appropriate. Upon entering the breakfast nook, he was met with a scene that caught him off guard. Sitting at the table with a drawing pad in front of her and colored pencils scattered around was a little girl. She must have been about 10, thin, with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded t-shirt and shorts that were already too small. Her eyes were large and dark, taking in everything. When Ethan entered, she looked up and stared at him with a curiosity that held no fear, only genuine interest. On the other side of the nook, putting cleaning supplies away in a cabinet, was the housekeeper, Maria. He remembered her name now. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, with tired but pretty features, her dark hair pulled back in a bun. When she saw Ethan, her face went pale. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry. Leah's school had a sudden closure today, and I had no one to leave her with. I promise she won't be any trouble. She'll just sit here quietly and draw while I work. Please, I really need this job." Maria's voice trembled. Ethan realized she was afraid of being fired right there, on the first day she brought her daughter. He looked again at the girl, Leah, who was still watching him with those intense eyes. There was something about her that disarmed him, though he couldn't say what. "It's fine," he said, surprising himself. "But I want her to stay here in the nook. She can't wander around the house." Maria let out a sigh of relief so deep it seemed she had been holding her breath for a full minute. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thank you so much. Leah, did you hear that? You stay here and draw, and don't leave this spot, okay?" The girl nodded, but her eyes never stopped watching Ethan. He felt a strange discomfort under her gaze. It was as if she could see things he kept hidden. He turned and went back to his office, trying to concentrate on the reports he needed to review before noon. But concentration wouldn't come. Something about that morning was different. The presence of that child in the house, as quiet as she was, altered the atmosphere. Ethan found himself thinking about things he normally wouldn't, about how hard it must be for Maria to raise a daughter alone, working as a cleaner in rich people's houses, about how calm Leah seemed, drawing in silence even in a strange place, about how he himself, with all his fortune and privilege, had no one waiting for him at home at the end of the day. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. Sentimentality led nowhere. He forced himself to focus on work, reviewed contracts, answered emails, made a few calls. When he looked at the clock, it was already past 11. He decided to go downstairs for a glass of water before his noon video conference. As he passed through the living room, he saw Maria cleaning the windows with quick, efficient movements. Leah was still in the nook, but now she was standing looking through the doorway into the living room. Ethan followed her gaze and realized she was looking at a painting on the wall, an abstract piece he had bought years ago more as an investment than for personal taste. Without much thought, he crossed the room toward the kitchen to get his water. That's when it happened. Leah took a few hesitant steps out of the nook, drawn by something Ethan couldn't see from where he was. When he returned from the kitchen, with the glass in his hand, the girl was standing in the middle of the living room looking directly at him, more precisely, looking at his left wrist. Ethan always wore the same watch. It was an old analog piece with a worn brown leather strap and a gold-plated face that no longer shone as it should. The crystal had a thin scratch on the bottom right corner. He didn't remember exactly where he had gotten it. It had been found among his mother's belongings after she passed, mixed in with other old things she kept. Ethan had started wearing it by chance and had gotten used to it. There was something comforting about the old object, as if it carried memories that weren't his, but welcomed him nonetheless. The girl took a few more steps, her eyes fixed on the watch. Maria, who had just noticed her daughter had left the nook, rushed toward her. "Leah, get back in the nook now." But the girl didn't obey. She kept walking until she was just a few feet from Ethan. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She slowly raised her hand, pointing to his wrist, and when she spoke, her voice came out trembling, filled with an emotion that seemed too big for such a small body. "That watch belonged to my grandpa." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. He looked at the girl, at the watch, at Maria, who stood frozen with her hands over her mouth. Something twisted inside him, a strange sensation he couldn't name. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. Leah kept looking at the watch as if she were seeing a ghost. "My mom always told me about Grandpa's watch. I never met him, but she always talked about him. She said he was a good man, that he went away because they accused him of something he didn't do, that he left this watch as a gift for me, even without knowing if I'd ever see it. I've drawn this watch so many times, mister. The scratch on the glass, the letters engraved on the back, the color of the leather. It's exactly the same. Maria finally reacted, pulling her daughter by the shoulders gently but firmly. Leah, stop. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. She makes up stories. She dreams a lot about this grandfather she never knew. Come on, let's go back to the Nook. But Ethan couldn't move. He looked at the watch on his wrist as if seeing it for the first time. The scratch on the glass, the engraved letters, the leather strap. Suddenly, this object he had worn for years without a second thought gained an immense weight. Who had owned this watch? Why was it among his mother's things? And why was this girl, his housekeeper's daughter, claiming with such conviction that it had belonged to her grandfather? Wait, he said, and his voice made Maria stop in her tracks. You said your father was accused of something he didn't do. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were moist. My father, Joseph. He worked at a big company here in New York many years ago. There was a scandal. They accused him of fraud, of embezzling money. He always swore he was innocent, but no one believed him. He lost everything. His job, his dignity, his will to live. One day he just left. I was young. I didn't really understand what had happened. I just know he left me this watch, said I should give it to my daughter when she grew up. He said that one day the truth would come out, that this watch would find its way back. I thought he was delirious from all the suffering. But Leah always believed. She's been drawing this watch since she was little. Ethan felt his heart race. Something was wrong, very wrong. His father, Anthony Hayes, had also worked at a big company. He had also been involved in a fraud scandal but had come out unscathed, his reputation intact. Ethan was very young at the time. He didn't understand the details, only that it had been a difficult period, that his father came home tense and silent, that his mother cried in secret. But then it all passed, and life went on. Or at least that's what he had always believed. What company was it, he asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Maria hesitated. Hayes and Associates. Ethan's world collapsed in that moment. It was his father's company, the company that later became his. The watch on his wrist suddenly burned like a branding iron. He took it off with jerky movements and stared at it, turning it over in his hands, looking for the engraved letters Leah had mentioned. And there they were, so worn they were almost illegible. Initials, J.M. Joseph Miller. Could it be possible? I have to go, he said abruptly. You can continue your work. I'm going out. Before Maria could answer, Ethan was already taking the stairs 2 at a time, entering his room, changing out of his work clothes and into something more casual. His mind was in a whirlwind. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know the truth about that watch, about his father's past, about the man who had been unjustly accused. If he had been unjustly accused, he grabbed his car keys and left the house without looking back. He drove through the streets of New York on autopilot, the heavy traffic barely registering in his consciousness. He stopped in front of a commercial building downtown, went up to the 10th floor, and entered a discreet office. This was where Roger worked, a private investigator Ethan had hired a few times to handle delicate business matters, a serious, efficient man who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Roger, I need you to investigate something for me, and I need it urgently. The investigator, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, nodded. Go ahead. I need to know everything about a man named Joseph Miller. He worked at Hayes and Associates about 20 years ago, give or take. He was accused of fraud. I need to know what really happened. Who else was involved? What happened to him afterward? Everything. Roger jotted down the information in a notebook, his face remaining neutral as always. How much time do I have? As fast as possible. Days, not weeks. The investigator nodded. I'll start today. Ethan left the office feeling strangely vulnerable. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of something. The truth he was about to uncover could change everything. Part of him wanted to turn back, to forget that morning, to continue living his orderly, predictable life. But another part, a part he didn't even know existed, needed to know, needed to understand. When he returned home, it was mid-afternoon. Maria was still there, finishing up the ironing in the laundry room. Leah was still in the nook, now lying on a towel on the floor, drawing. Ethan stopped at the door and watched the girl for a moment. She was drawing with impressive concentration, her tongue between her teeth, her eyes focused on the paper. When she noticed his presence, she looked up. "Sorry I talked about the watch," she said in a small voice. "My mum said I shouldn't have." Ethan entered the nook and, surprising himself, sat on the floor next to her. Up close he could see the drawing. It was a watch. The watch. Every detail was there, drawn with a care that only a child, obsessed with something, could have. "You don't need to apologize," he said. "Are you sure this is your grandpa's watch?" Leah nodded, her eyes shining. "My mom always told the story. She said Grandpa was a good man, that he worked really hard, that he loved us even though he never met me. That one day he was accused of something bad but he didn't do it, that he suffered a lot and went away. But before he left this watch. He said it was the only valuable thing he had, that it was for me because I was his future even if he couldn't be here." The girl's words were simple, but they carried an immense weight. Ethan felt something break inside him. An old anger, directed at no one in particular, began to take shape. If this was true, if Joseph Miller was really innocent, then someone had used him as a scapegoat. And given the coincidence of the companies, the presence of the watch among his mother's belongings, there was a terrible possibility that this someone had been his own father. He looked at Leah, at this child who drew watches in search of a grandfather she had never known, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: empathy, pain, responsibility. If his father had truly committed this injustice, then Ethan carried part of that debt, not by choice but by inheritance. "I'm going to find out the truth," he said, more to himself than to the girl. "I promise." Leah smiled, a small but genuine smile, and went back to her drawing. Ethan sat there for a few more minutes, watching her, trying to understand how his orderly and controlled life had been turned upside down in a single morning. When he finally got up and returned to his office, the weight of the watch on his wrist felt different. It was no longer just an object. It was an unfulfilled promise, an injustice that needed to be righted, a story that demanded to be told. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the morning over and over in his mind. Leah's look when she recognized the watch, Maria's choked voice when she spoke of her father. The sudden weight of a past he never knew existed. For the first time, in a long time, Ethan felt small. He was no longer the man in control, the successful businessman, the loner who needed no one. He was just a son trying to understand the mistakes of a father who was no longer here to give explanations. He got up before dawn, took a cold shower, got dressed, and went to his home office. He opened drawers he hadn't opened in years, rummaged through boxes stored in the closet, looking for anything that might give him clues about that period of his father's life. He found some old documents, receipts, letters, but nothing that explained the connection to Joseph Miller or the origin of the watch. It was then that he remembered something. In the attic, there were more boxes, things of his mother's that he had never had the courage to go through. He climbed the narrow stairs, turned on the dim light and began to search. Photo albums, old clothes, books. And then, at the bottom of a dusty box, he found a sealed manila envelope. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were old photos. His father, much younger, next to another man. They were both wearing suits, standing, in front of the company building, smiling for the camera. Ethan turned the photo over. On the back, written in his mother's handwriting, it read, "Anthony and Joseph, 1998. Partnership." Ethan's heart pounded. Partnership? His father and Joseph Miller were partners? But then why was Joseph accused and not his father? Why was the official story that Joseph Miller was a dishonest employee and not a betrayed partner? He kept looking in the envelope and found more photos. His father and Joseph at a barbecue, laughing, the two families together in a park. And in one of the photos, Joseph was wearing the watch. The same watch that was now on Ethan's desk, a silent witness to a truth he still didn't fully know. He sat on the dusty attic floor, the photos scattered around him, and for the first time in his adult life, Ethan Hayes cried. He cried for Joseph Miller's lost innocence. He cried for Maria's stolen childhood. He cried for the granddaughter who grew up drawing the memory of a grandfather she never knew. And he cried for himself, for the man he had become without ever questioning where his fortune, his position, his last name, came from. When the sun rose, Ethan was on the phone with Roger. "I found photos. My father and Joseph Miller were partners. I need to know what happened, Roger. Everything." The investigator's serious voice came from the other end of the line. "I've already started gathering information. I should have something by the end of the week." Ethan hung up and stared out the attic window, watching the city wake up below. New York was immense, full of stories like this one, of injustices buried under concrete and progress. How many families had been destroyed so that others could prosper? How many Joseph Millers were out there living with the weight of false accusations, while the real culprits slept soundly in their mansions? But now, at least this time, the truth would come out. Ethan would make sure of it. Not out of pity, not out of kindness, but because it was the right thing to do. Because that watch on his wrist wasn't just an object, it was a debt, and debts had to be paid. The next morning, Maria woke up with a knot in her stomach. She hadn't been able to sleep all night. Mr. Hayes's words on the phone echoed in her head like a funeral bell. He knew. Somehow he had found out about her father, about the past, about the shame Maria had carried like an invisible cross for over 20 years. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's expression on the day everything fell apart. She saw the confusion, the indignation, the growing despair as the accusations piled up, and no one believed his word. She saw the nights he sat on the old living room couch, holding his head in his hands, murmuring that he was innocent, that he didn't understand how this was happening. She saw her mother trying to console him, while she herself was falling apart inside. Maria had been 15 when it all started, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but too young to know how to help. She got up from the narrow bed she shared with Leah in their one-bedroom apartment and looked out the foggy window. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. In the background, she could hear the noise of trucks on the avenue and the shouts of street vendors at the corner market. A dog was barking incessantly in the next apartment. Mrs. Davis's television downstairs was on full volume, as always. This was her world, simple, hard, noisy, but familiar. And now, because of a watch and her daughter's innocent curiosity, that world was threatening to crumble. Leah was still asleep, her peaceful face buried in the worn pillow. She was so small, so fragile. Maria felt her chest tighten every time she looked at her daughter. She deserved so much more than this life. She deserved a house with a yard, a better school, new clothes, toys that weren't second-hand. She deserved not to have to grow up hearing her mother crying in the bathroom when she thought no one was listening. She deserved not to carry the weight of a last name, stained by accusations that were never proven, but never forgotten. Maria made some weak coffee and ate a piece of stale bread with margarine. She had no appetite, but she needed energy. At 8 o'clock, she gently woke Leah, helped the girl get dressed, and comb her hair. Leah was quiet, sensing that something was worrying her mother, but not quite sure what. On the way to the Upper East Side, inside the crowded bus that swayed on the potholed streets, Maria held her daughter's hand tightly. "Leah, Mr. Hayes is going to talk to us today," she said, her voice low so the other passengers wouldn't hear. "He found out things about your grandpa, things from the past. I need you to be quiet, okay? Let me talk to him." Leah nodded, her eyes wide. "Is he going to give back the watch?" Maria felt her eyes sting. "I don't know, honey. I don't know." When they arrived at the mansion, Ethan was waiting for them in the living room. He looked different. He was wearing casual clothes, a light blue button-down shirt and beige twill pants. His hair, always perfectly combed, was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it several times. There were dark circles under his eyes. It was obvious he hadn't slept well either. Spread out on the coffee table were documents, old photos, and a brown folder full of papers. The room smelled of strong coffee, and there was a half-empty cup on a corner of the table. surrounded by breadcrumbs. Maria had never seen the room like this, whenever she cleaned. In here everything was impeccable, organized, almost sterile. But now it looked like a research hurricane had swept through the place. There were sticky notes on the edges of some documents, colored tabs sticking out of folders, a laptop open to complex spreadsheets. It was the mess of someone obsessed with finding answers. "Good morning," he said, and his voice sounded softer than Maria had expected. "Please, have a seat." Maria settled onto the light leather sofa, pulling Leah close. The girl couldn't take her eyes off Ethan, as if trying to decipher what he was about to say. Ethan sat in the armchair across from them, folded his hands over his knees and took a deep breath. "I need to start by apologizing," he said, looking directly at Maria. "I'm sorry for investigating your life without permission. I'm sorry for what my father did to yours, and I'm sorry it took so long to find out the truth." Maria blinked, surprised. This was not what she had expected to hear. She had expected accusations, maybe, expected him to fire her, expected contempt, but not an apology, not this vulnerability in his eyes. "I hired an investigator," Ethan continued, "and I found out who Joseph Miller was. I found out he worked at my father's company for 13 years. I found out about the 1995 scandal. I found out he was accused of fraud and lost everything." He picked up the black and white photo from the table and handed it to Maria. "I found this in the attic. This is your father, isn't it?" Maria took the photo with trembling hands. As soon as she saw her father's face, young and smiling next to Anthony Hayes, the tears began to fall. She couldn't hold them back. It had been so long since she'd seen a picture of him. When Joseph disappeared, he had taken everything he had with him. The family was left with only a few memories, and the story Maria repeated to her daughter like a mantra. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my dad." Leah moved closer, looking at the photo with fascination. "That's my grandpa." "Yes, honey, that's your grandpa, Joseph." Ethan watched the scene in silence. Something was churning inside him. Seeing these two women crying over a yellowed photo, seeing the raw naked pain on their faces, was like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life avoiding emotions, building walls around his heart, keeping his distance from anything that could make him feel. But now, sitting here in this room, where he had never received visitors, where he had never laughed or cried, he felt the walls begin to crumble. "Tell me about him," Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "Tell me the truth." Maria wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. She started slowly, as if each word hurt to say. She told him that Joseph was a good man, hard-working, honest, that he loved his family above all else, that he woke up early every day and came home late, but always found time to help her with her homework, that he brought flowers for his wife on Saturdays, even when money was tight, that he dreamed of buying their own house with a yard where she could play, that he worked at Hayes and Associates with pride, that he spoke of Anthony Hayes at home as a visionary, an example to follow, that he admired his boss as a mentor and a friend, that he dreamed of giving his wife and young daughter a better life. She told him how Joseph would come home talking about the company's projects, about the buildings they were constructing, about how much he was learning about the industry every day. He had plans. He wanted to take courses, to grow professionally, to make his family proud. And then in 1995, when the scandal broke, he was caught completely by surprise. One day he was working normally, confident he was doing his job with excellence, and the next he was being accused of crimes he didn't even fully understand. They said he had embezzled money. They said he had forged documents. They said he had betrayed everyone's trust. But Joseph swore his innocence until the end. He swore he would never do something like that someone was using him as a scapegoat. But no one believed him. The evidence seemed so solid. The documents had his signature. The transfers had been authorized with codes only he knew. How could he explain that without sounding like a liar? He tried to prove he was innocent, Maria continued, her voice choked with emotion. He tried for years. He spent all his savings on lawyers who got nowhere. No one would hire him. No one wanted to talk to him. People would cross the street when they saw him. I was 15 when it happened. I watched my father waste away. I watched him lose the light in his eyes. I watched him sit on our porch staring at nothing, as if he wasn't even there anymore. She paused, wiping away more tears. Leah held her hand tightly. One day, in 2001, he woke up early. He kissed my forehead. He left a note saying we'd be better off without him, that he only brought shame to the family, that he loved us but he had to leave, and he left. Maria looked at Ethan with red-rimmed eyes. We never heard from him again. We don't know if he's alive. We don't know where he is. He just vanished. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Ethan felt as if he had swallowed stones. All of this was his father's fault. Maybe not directly, but omission was also a form of guilt. Anthony Hayes had come out of the scandal unscathed, while Joseph Miller was destroyed. And Ethan, without knowing, had built his life on that injustice. Before he left, Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. He left the watch. He said it was for Leah, even though she hadn't been born yet. He said that one day, somehow, the watch would find its way back to its rightful owner. My mother kept the watch for years. But when she got sick and we needed money, we had to sell a lot of things. The watch was sold at a pawn shop. I never imagined that. She couldn't finish the sentence. She looked at Ethan's wrist, where the watch was fastened. Ethan followed her gaze and, in a slow, deliberate motion, took the watch off. He held it in his palm for a moment, feeling its weight one last time. Then he held it out to Leah. "This belongs to you," he said. Leah looked at her mother, as if asking for permission. Maria nodded, crying. The girl took the watch with both hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and maybe it was. It was the only tangible piece of the grandfather she had never known. It was proof that he existed, that he had loved her even before she was born. "Thank you," Leah whispered, clutching the watch to her chest. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He never imagined that returning an object could hurt so much, but at the same time, there was something liberating in the gesture, as if, by letting go of the watch, he was also letting go of a weight he had been carrying without knowing it. "But this isn't enough," Ethan said, getting up and starting to pace the room. "Giving back the watch doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the injustice. It doesn't bring your father back." Maria watched him, confused. What was he getting at? Ethan stopped pacing and faced them. "I want to find your father. I want to bring him back. I want to clear his name." Maria's eyes widened. "You can't do that. It's been so many years. Nobody cares anymore. And even if you found him, how would you prove he's innocent?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "But I have to try. My father is gone, but the company records exist. I'm going to find out the truth. And I'm going to make it right." "But why would you do that? Why do you care?" Ethan was silent for a long moment. He didn't know exactly how to answer. Why did he care? He didn't know Joseph Miller. He didn't owe him anything. But there was something about this whole story that bothered him deeply. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need to repair his father's mistakes. Or maybe, for the first time in his life, he was feeling genuine empathy for someone else. Something that went beyond numbers, contracts, and profits. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. Maria looked at him for a long moment. There was skepticism there. Of course, she had spent her whole life dealing with people who made promises and didn't keep them, but there was also a spark of hope, a hope so small and fragile that she was afraid to nurture it, afraid of being disappointed again. "If you can find my father," she said, her voice trembling, "if you can bring him back, man, I will never forget this." Ethan nodded. "I'll start today." In the days that followed, Ethan dove into the investigation with an intensity that surprised even himself. He hired not one but 3 different private investigators. He asked each, one to work independently, following different leads. He wanted to make sure he didn't miss a single detail. At the same time, he began to dig through the old archives of Hayes and Associates. He spent entire nights in his office, reading financial reports from 1995, analyzing bank transfers, studying signatures on documents. It was exhausting and frustrating work. Many files had been lost or destroyed over the years. But Ethan was persistent. Maria continued to work at the mansion, but now there was a different dynamic between her and Ethan. It was no longer just employer and employee. There was a connection, a silent partnership. She saw how dedicated he was to the investigation, how he stayed up late studying papers, how he made call after call, and for the first time in many years, Maria allowed herself to feel something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Leah started visiting the mansion more often. Maria would bring her on weekends when there was no school. Ethan, who had never known how to deal with children, found himself surprisingly at ease in the girl's presence. Leah was curious, talked non-stop, asked questions about everything, and Ethan, to his own surprise, answered. He showed her the paintings on the walls, explained where they came from. He let her explore the enormous library on the second floor. He even allowed her to use the grand piano in the music room, an expensive instrument that had gone untouched for years. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan found Leah sitting on the stairs, drawing in her notebook. He approached, curious. "Can I see?" Leah showed him the drawing. It was the mansion, seen from the outside, with all the windows lit up and flowers in the garden. In the drawing there were 3 figures at the front door: a woman, a girl, and a tall man. They were all smiling. "That's us," Leah explained, pointing to the figures. "Mom, me and you." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "It's beautiful. You can have it if you want." He took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious. "Thank you, Leah." The girl smiled and went back to drawing. Ethan went up to his office with the sheet of paper in his hands. Once there, he looked for an empty picture frame on one of the shelves and placed the drawing inside. Then, he positioned the frame on his desk where he could see it while he worked. It was strange how that childish drawing, made with colored pencils and clumsy lines, brought more life to that office than any expensive work of art ever had. Meanwhile, the investigation began to yield results. One of the investigators found a lead. A man matching Joseph Miller's description was living in a small town in upstate New York. He was working on a small farm, helping with crops in exchange for room and board. He was using another name, but the physical description and age matched. The investigator managed to get a long-distance photo taken with a telephoto lens. When Ethan showed the picture to Maria, she burst into tears. "It's him. It's my dad." Ethan felt his heart race. They had found Joseph Miller. After more than 20 years missing, after being presumed possibly dead, he was alive, living in hiding under another name, but alive. "I want to go there," Ethan said. "I want to talk to him in person." Maria shook her head. "He won't want to talk to a Hayes. He'll think it's some kind of trap." "Then you'll come with me, you and Leah. If he sees you, he'll know it's not a trap." Maria hesitated. The idea of seeing her father again after so many years terrified her as much as it excited her. What if he didn't want to see them? What if he was so changed that he didn't recognize them? What if the disappointment was too great? But Leah, who had overheard the entire conversation, said with the typical confidence of children, "I want to meet my grandpa." And so the decision was made. 3 days later, Ethan, Maria, and Leah were in a rental car, driving along the winding roads of upstate New York. The trip took almost 6 hours, with Ethan at the wheel and the 2 of them in the back seat. It was strange for him to be driving. He usually had a driver for everything, but this was different. This was personal. The highway transformed as they drove on. The urban landscapes of New York City gave way to smaller towns, then villages, then vast expanses of green. Mountains rose on the horizon, covered in morning mist. They passed farms with grazing cattle, apple orchards, and red dirt roads that led to unknown places. Leah slept for most of the way, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, lulled by the car's movement and the soft hum of the engine. Maria stayed awake the whole time, looking out the window, her heart racing, her hands sweating. She tried to imagine what the reunion would be like. What would she say? How would he look? Would he recognize her? 24 years had passed. She was a girl when he left. Now she was a grown woman, a mother, marked by life. Ethan drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to check on them. He was nervous too, though he wouldn't admit it. What would he say to a man whose life his family had destroyed? How could he apologize for something he didn't do but carried in his last name? The town was small, the kind with just one main street, where everyone knows everyone. The farm was on the outskirts, accessible only by a bumpy dirt road. When they arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. The landscape was beautiful, bucolic. There was a simple wooden house, a chicken coop, a well-tended vegetable garden. In the distance, among the trees, Ethan saw the silhouette of a man working. They got out of the car slowly. Maria held Leah's hand so tightly that the girl complained softly. Ethan followed a few steps behind, respecting the moment. The man must have heard the car because he stopped working and looked in their direction. He stood there, a hoe in his hands, watching the unexpected visitors. And then, as the distance closed and their faces became clearer, he let the hoe fall to the ground. Joseph Miller was 71 years old. He was thinner than in the old photo, his face marked by deep wrinkles, his hair completely white. His hands were calloused, his back slightly stooped from hard labor. He wore simple, worn-out clothes, but his eyes were the same as in the photograph. Dark, attentive eyes which were now filling with tears. "Maria?" His voice came out hoarse, trembling as if saying that name cost him all his energy. "Dad." Maria couldn't say anything else. She ran to him and threw herself into his arms. Joseph held her tightly, sobbing, repeating his daughter's name like a prayer. It was more than 20 years of distance, more than 20 years of pain disappearing in that tight embrace. Leah stood still, watching. She had never seen her mother cry like that. These were different tears, tears of happiness mixed with sadness, with relief, with longing. Ethan placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, a gentle gesture of support. When Maria finally pulled away, still holding her father's arms as if afraid he would disappear again, she said, "Dad, this is Leah, your granddaughter." Joseph looked at the girl, and a fresh stream of tears ran down his face. He knelt on the dirt ground to be at her level. "Leah, my granddaughter, I didn't even know you existed." Leah, shy but determined, took something out of her pocket. It was the watch. She held it out to her grandfather. "Mom always talked about you. She always said you were a good man. And this watch, it found its way back." Joseph took the watch with trembling hands. He looked at it as if he were seeing a ghost from the past. He caressed the worn leather strap, ran his fingers over the scratched crystal, turned it over to see the engraved letters on the back. J.M. Joseph Miller. He pressed the watch against his chest and cried like a child. It was only then that he noticed Ethan, standing a few yards back. Joseph recognized the face immediately. It was impossible not to. The same features as Anthony Hayes, the same erect posture, the same imposing bearing. Joseph felt his entire body tense up. His eyes, which had been brimming with happiness, now filled with fear and anger. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out hard, accusatory. Ethan took a step forward. "I came to apologize. I came to do what's right. I came to give you your life back." Joseph shook his head bitterly. "There's no such thing. My life ended more than 20 years ago. You can't give it back." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed. "But I can clear your name. I can prove you were innocent. I can make sure everyone knows the truth." "And what truth is that?" Joseph's voice was laden with suspicion. Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't have concrete proof, but he had conviction. "The truth that you were used as a scapegoat. That my father or someone close to him committed the fraud and put the blame on you." Joseph let out a humorless laugh. "You think I didn't try to prove that? You think I didn't fight? No one would listen to me. No one believed me. I believe you." The words hung in the air between them. Joseph looked at Ethan for a long moment, searching for signs of a lie, of manipulation. But all he saw was raw sincerity. "Why?" Joseph asked. "Why do you believe me?" Ethan looked at Leah, then at Maria, then back at Joseph. Because I've seen what my family destroyed. I've seen the pain it caused, and I can't live with that." Joseph fell silent. The sun had completely set now. Night was falling quickly over the farm. In the distance, they could hear crickets chirping and the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. The old man looked at the watch in his hands, then at the granddaughter he had just met, then at the daughter he hadn't seen in so long, and then, for the first time in over 20 years, Joseph Miller allowed himself to feel something other than pain and shame. He allowed himself to feel hope. It was a strange, almost forgotten sensation, like an atrophied muscle trying to move again. He had grown so accustomed to bitterness, to resignation, that hope seemed dangerous, something that could hurt him again. But looking at the granddaughter he had just met, at the daughter who had come back to him, at the young Hayes who promised to do what was right, Joseph felt that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk to believe again. "Come inside," he said, pointing to the simple house. "Let's talk." And so, under the starry sky of upstate New York, 4 very different people sat around a rustic wooden table, lit only by an oil lamp, and began to weave the threads of a story that was far from over. The house was small and modest, with unpainted wooden walls and a roof that showed the shingles from inside. There was a tiny kitchen, a bedroom that barely fit a bed, and that one room that served as a kitchen, dining room, and living room all at once. But it was clean, organized. There were wildflowers in a glass of water on the table. There were books stacked in a corner. There was a dignity in that simplicity that touched Ethan deeply. Joseph made coffee in an old kettle, served it in mismatched mugs he must have been given or found over the years. He cut a slice of cornbread that the farm's owner had made and shared with him. And there, at that humble table, with the aroma of coffee filling the air and the silence of the night all around, they began to talk. About the past, about the pain, about the injustice, but also about the future, about possibilities, about the chance to start over. Leah held her grandfather's hand tightly, as if afraid he would disappear again. Maria cried silently, tears that were both sad and happy. Ethan listened to everything, absorbing every word, every detail, every emotion. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about business, about profits, about contracts. He was simply there, present, human, feeling. The conversation at the farm lasted late into the night. Joseph told them everything, every detail of those terrible years. He talked about his routine at Hayes and Associates, about the responsibilities he had, about the trust Anthony placed in him. He would start his day at 7, reviewing financial reports, approving payments, supervising the accounting team. It was a job he loved. He felt useful, important, part of something bigger. Anthony trusted him so much that he had given him power of attorney to sign documents in his name when necessary. It was an honor, a testament of trust. Joseph took that responsibility seriously, treating every number, every contract, every decision as if it were his own company. He spoke of that fateful day in September 1995 when he was called into his boss's office and found not only Anthony, but also lawyers, external accountants, and a chilly atmosphere that foretold a storm. The room felt heavy, the air thick. Everyone looked at him with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt. They said they had found serious irregularities, systematic embezzlement of funds into ghost accounts, forged documents, fraudulent contracts, and all the evidence pointed to him. Joseph still remembered his first thought. This is a mistake. Some system error, some mix-up in the records. It would all be cleared up soon. Soon everyone would laugh at the misunderstanding. But there were no laughs, only heavy silence and accusing stares. Joseph remembered every second of that moment, the feeling of the floor disappearing from under his feet, the absolute confusion, the certainty that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in minutes. But the minutes turned into hours, and the hours into days, and the more he denied it, the guiltier he seemed. His access codes had been used. His signature was on the documents. His bank passwords had authorized the transfers. How could someone have done that without his knowledge? He had no answer. And without an answer, he had only his word against the evidence. Anthony looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, Joseph said, his voice choked. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment, as if I had betrayed a friend, and maybe that hurt more than anything, because I admired him. I trusted him. And there he was, looking at me like I was a stranger, as if everything we had built together was a lie. Ethan listened with a growing weight in his chest. He tried to imagine his father in that situation. Anthony Hayes had always been a calculating man, cold in business, but would he be capable of deliberately destroying an innocent person, or had he been deceived as well? "Do you think my father knew?" The question came out before Ethan could think better of it. "Do you think he was behind the fraud?" Joseph was silent for a long moment. His fingers drummed on the table, the watch back on the wrist where it always should have been. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "For years, I wanted to believe he was also deceived, that someone used us as pawns in a bigger game. But when you lose everything, when your life falls apart and the person who could have helped you just abandons you..." He stopped, took a deep breath. "It's hard not to be suspicious." "But you never had concrete proof," Ethan said. "No, just the feeling that something didn't add up. The transfers happened during a period when I was on vacation. 2 weeks I took to care for my wife, who was sick. When I came back, it had all already happened. The documents were dated from that period, but I swear I never signed them. I tried to argue that, but they said the documents could have been prepared beforehand and executed later." Maria, who had heard this story so many times but never with so many details, held her father's hand. "Did you have enemies at the company? Someone who wanted your job?" Joseph thought. "There was one man, Richard Davis. He was the operations manager, ambitious, always wanted to move up, but Anthony preferred to keep him where he was. Richard had access to some systems, but not as much as I did. I remember he was very interested when I took that vacation. He asked to be responsible for some of my duties while I was away. Anthony authorized it." Ethan felt something click in his brain. A name, a lead. "Richard Davis. Does he still work for the company?" "I don't know. After I left, I cut all ties with that world. I don't know what happened to the people there." But Ethan knew, or he would find out. He took out his phone and sent a message to Roger, the investigator. "I need everything on Richard Davis, former employee of Hayes and Associates. 90s, urgent." The reply came minutes later. "On it." Leah, who had been sitting quietly listening to the adults talk about things she barely understood, yawned. It was late. The girl was tired. Maria noticed and looked at Ethan. "We should go. It's getting very late." But Joseph stood up quickly. "You're not going anywhere at this hour. The road is dangerous at night. Stay here. I don't have much space, but we'll manage." And that's how Ethan Hayes, accustomed to 5-star hotel suites and 1,000 thread-count sheets, spent the night sleeping on the floor of a wooden house in upstate New York, covered by an old blanket and using a makeshift pillow. At first, the physical discomfort was unbearable. The floor was hard, the blanket scratchy, the pillow too thin. He tossed and turned, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. But gradually, something strange happened. The discomfort began to seem less important. Through the open window came the sound of crickets and the smell of damp earth. The sky was so full of stars it seemed unreal, as if someone had scattered diamonds on a black velvet cloth. Ethan had never seen so many stars. In New York, with all the light pollution, the night sky was always empty, washed out. But here, far from the city, lights, the universe revealed itself in all its grandeur, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, part of something bigger, part of a story that wasn't just his, but of real people, with real pain and real hopes. Maria and Leah shared the bed with Joseph, the three of them squeezed together but happy to be reunited. He could hear their whispers from the next room, quiet conversations punctuated by muffled laughter and emotional sighs. It was the sound of a family finding each other again. It was the sound of wounds beginning to heal. Ethan didn't sleep much. He lay there looking at the wooden ceiling, thinking about everything he had heard, thinking about his father, thinking about Richard Davis, thinking about how he was going to prove Joseph's innocence after so many years. But as difficult as it was, he wasn't going to give up. For the first time in his life, Ethan had a purpose that went beyond money and power. He had something worth fighting for. The next morning they woke early to the crowing of roosters. Joseph made simple but strong coffee, and they ate bread and butter while planning their next steps. It was decided that Joseph would return to New York City with them. After more than 20 years in hiding, it was time to face the past. He was nervous, of course, afraid of being recognized, of being pointed at on the streets, of reliving all the humiliation. But Maria held his hand and said, "You're not alone anymore, Dad. We're in this together." And Joseph, with tears in his eyes, agreed. The drive back was different. Joseph sat in the front seat next to Ethan. They talked the entire way. About life, about regrets, about second chances. Joseph told him about his years in hiding, about the humble jobs he had taken, about the nights he almost went back but didn't have the courage. Ethan, in turn, spoke about his loneliness, about the coldness with which he lived, about how he never really knew who his father was. Anthony was a complicated man, Joseph said, brilliant in business, but distant from people. I don't think he ever knew how to be close to anyone, not his wife, not his son. Ethan nodded. He recognized that description. I'm just like him. Or I was. I don't know anymore. So you have time to be different, Joseph said. I see how you look at Leah. I see how you're trying to do the right thing. That already makes you different. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan didn't reply, but something inside him warmed. When they arrived in New York, it was late afternoon. Ethan took Joseph straight to the mansion. He offered him one of the guest rooms, arranged for clean clothes, and provided everything the man might need. Maria and Leah went home but promised to return the next day. Joseph was left alone in the immense room, looking around with a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. It had been so long since he had been in a place like this. The last time, he had also been a different man, a man with dignity, with a career, with a future. Now he was just an old man trying to reclaim what time had taken. That night, Ethan received a call from Roger. The investigator had news about Richard Davis. I found some interesting information, Roger said. Richard Davis worked at Hayes & Associates until 1998. 3 years after the scandal, he resigned and started his own company, a smaller development firm but very successful. Today he's retired, lives in a luxury gated community in Greenwich. Rich. Very rich. Ethan felt his stomach churn. Rich? How? Where did that money come from? That's the interesting part. His company grew very fast, too fast. In the first 2 years, he closed deals that a small company normally couldn't. Almost as if he had an advantage. Inside information, maybe. You think he used the embezzled money to start his own business? It's a possibility, but it'll be hard to prove after all these years. Ethan hung up the phone and went to Joseph's room. He knocked on the door and entered when he heard a reply. Joseph was sitting on the edge of the bed, still dressed, looking out the window. We found something, Ethan said. Richard Davis got rich, very rich, right after the scandal. Joseph's eyes lit up. Hope and anger mixed together. So it was him. It looks like it. But we need proof. We need something concrete that connects him to the fraud. How are we going to get that? Ethan thought for a moment. By confronting him. Directly. The next day, Ethan and Joseph drove to the gated community in Greenwich. It was an ostentatious place with strict security, immense gardens, and houses that looked like small palaces. The kind of place where every resident tried to outdo the other in displays of wealth. Imported cars parked in the driveways, infinity pools, outdoor kitchens that looked professional. Richard Davis lived in one of the largest houses, a white colonial with Greek columns out front, as if it were an embassy. Ethan used his name and position to get in. He said it was about old business from Hayes & Associates. The guard, a young man in an impeccable uniform, called the house and, after a few minutes of waiting that felt like an eternity, authorized their entry. As they drove through the tree-lined streets of the community, Joseph felt his heart pound. He was about to confront the man who had destroyed his life. He was going to look him in the eye and demand answers. His hands trembled slightly, clenched on his knees. Ethan noticed, and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "I'm here with you," he said, and Joseph nodded, grateful for the support. Richard Davis received them in their private office inside the house. The room was decorated with expensive but questionable taste, abstract paintings that probably cost a fortune but said nothing, a solid mahogany desk too large for the space, shelves with books that looked like they had never been opened, chosen for the color of their spines to match the decor. It was an office meant to impress, not to work in. Richard was a man in his 70s but well preserved, the kind who clearly took care of his appearance with expensive treatments. Well-cut white hair, not a strand out of place, dyed a deliberate silver, an artificial tan, teeth too white to be natural. He wore clothes that were both expensive and casual, a designer polo shirt, linen pants, Italian loafers without socks, and a watch that was worth more than most people make in a year, a Patek Philippe that gleamed on his wrist like a trophy. He was the picture of wealth obtained with no apparent effort, the kind of person who had retired early and now lived off investments while playing golf and traveling to Europe twice a year. He greeted Ethan with a professional smile, extending his hand, his perfect teeth gleaming. It was the smile of someone used to negotiating, charming, manipulating. But when he saw Joseph behind him, entering the room with cautious steps, the smile froze. The outstretched hand dropped. His face, once relaxed and confident, became tense. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he managed to regain control. "Joseph Miller," Richard said, his voice a mixture of surprise and discomfort. "I thought you were dead," Joseph completed, his voice hard. "A lot of people thought so, but I'm still here." Richard looked from one to the other, clearly trying to understand what was happening. "What do you want?" Ethan got straight to the point. "We want the truth about 1995. We want to know who really committed the fraud at Hayes and Associates." Richard gave a humorless laugh. "That was almost 30 years ago. Why would I know anything about it?" "Because you were there," Joseph said, taking a step forward. "Because you took over my duties when I went on vacation. Because you had access to the systems. And because you got very rich right after I was gone." Richard's face hardened. "Be careful what you're implying. I built my company with honest work." "Then you won't mind if I request a full audit of your company's early years?" Ethan said. "You won't mind if we investigate where the initial capital came from?" Richard fell silent. His eyes darted back and forth, calculating, assessing. Finally he sighed. "Even if there was something, and I'm not saying there is, the statute of limitations has run out. There's nothing you can do legally." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed, "but I can destroy your reputation. I can tell everyone you built your empire on stolen money. I can make public what you did. And believe me, I have the means to do it." Richard stared at him with a mixture of anger and fear. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead, despite the powerful air conditioning. His hands were clenched into fists on the desk. "You're just like your father," he said, spitting the words. "Thinking you can control everything, that you can destroy anyone you want, thinking the whole world belongs to you." "Was my father involved in this?" The question came out harsher than Ethan intended, more desperate, because a part of him still wanted to believe he wasn't, that it was a misunderstanding, that the father who raised him as cold as he was wasn't capable of such deliberate cruelty. Richard hesitated. He looked from Ethan to Joseph and back. He seemed to be weighing every word, calculating what to reveal, what to hide. His fingers drummed nervously on the mahogany desk. "Your father was smart," he said finally, his voice low but filled with bitterness. "Very smart. He knew what I did. He found evidence. He had documents that incriminated me. He could have turned me in, could have destroyed me, but he didn't." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "What did he do?" "He made a deal with me." The words came out slowly, each one like a stone dropping into a bottomless well. "He would keep my involvement a secret if I left the company quietly and shared a portion of the profits with him. A gentleman's agreement, as he liked to say. I would get rich and stay quiet. He would maintain his reputation and get a percentage of what I generated with the embezzled money. A win-win, as you business types like to say." Richard gave a bitter laugh. We used Joseph as the scapegoat. It was convenient for everyone, except for him, of course. Richard pointed at Joseph with disdain, as if he were just a chess piece that had been sacrificed in a necessary move. Joseph felt his legs grow weak. So it was true. Anthony knew. He knew from the beginning. And he chose to destroy an innocent man to protect his own reputation and make dirty money. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the stomach. His father didn't just know. He participated. He was an accomplice. He was just as guilty as Richard, maybe more so because he had betrayed the trust of a partner. "Do you have proof of this?" Ethan asked, his voice sounding strange. Richard smiled bitterly. "I kept everything. Documents, recordings of conversations, old emails. I thought I might need it one day. Never imagined it would be because of his son. I want all of it, now. And why would I give it to you?" Ethan leaned over the desk. "Because if you don't, I'll find it myself. And when I prove what you did, it won't just be your reputation that's finished. I will sue you for every penny you stole. I will make you lose everything. Your house, your money, your peace, so you decide. Give me the proof voluntarily and I'll make sure your name stays out of the public story, or you refuse and I destroy you." The silence in the room was heavy. Richard knew he was cornered. He knew Ethan had the power and resources to do everything he threatened. Finally, he stood up and went to a safe hidden behind a painting. He entered the combination and took out a metal box. Inside were envelopes, flash drives, and old documents. "This is everything," he said, pushing the box toward Ethan. "Now get out of my house, and I hope to never see you again." Ethan took the box, held Joseph by the arm, and walked out of there without looking back. In the car, Joseph cried silently. Tears of anger, of relief, of sadness. He cried for the man he had admired and who had betrayed him. He cried for the lost years. He cried for the confirmed injustice. But there was also a small spark of satisfaction. Finally, after so long, he had the truth. He had proof. He had his innocence back. Ethan drove in. Silence. The anger he felt toward his father was like a fire burning inside him. The entire image he had of Anthony Hayes had crumbled. The man he thought he knew was a stranger, a liar, a thief, a coward who destroyed an innocent man to save his own skin. When they arrived at the mansion, Ethan asked Joseph to rest. He had to do something. He had to confront his father's legacy. He had to make things right. Ethan had proof. He had witnesses. And he had determination. He was going to get justice. For Joseph, for Maria, for Leah, and for himself. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan Hayes was doing the right thing. And that was worth more than any fortune. The days following the confrontation with Richard were a flurry of intense activity. Ethan hired the best lawyers in New York, specialists in corporate law and fraud cases. He gathered all the documentation Richard had provided, organized every piece of evidence chronologically, every proof, every paper trail that connected his father to the scheme. There were printed emails from old computers with that characteristic font of the 90s. There were cassette tape recordings of phone conversations where Anthony and Richard discussed how to split the profits. There were signed contracts, documented bank transfers, even handwritten notes from Anthony calculating his percentage of the illicit gains. It was a complete collection of guilt, meticulously kept by a man who always knew he might one day need to protect himself. Joseph participated in all the meetings with the lawyers. At first he was nervous, reticent. It had been decades since he had set foot in a corporate office, worn formal clothes or sat in expensive leather chairs. He felt like an intruder, as if he didn't belong in that world of glass and marble, but Ethan was always by his side, encouraging, supporting. And slowly, Joseph began to regain something he thought he had lost forever, his voice, his ability to speak with clarity, with conviction, about what had happened. He was no longer the broken man who had fled in 2001. He was a survivor, and he was ready to tell his story. Maria was also present at many of the meetings. She had her own testimony to give, memories of how her family's life fell apart, how her mother fell ill from grief, how she had to drop out of school at 16 to work and help at home, how she grew up hearing malicious whispers about her father, about the Miller family, how she carried that shame like a second skin her entire adult life. Her voice trembled as she recounted these things, but she didn't stop. It needed to be on the record. The world needed to know the human cost of some people's greed. Leah, meanwhile, had become a constant presence at the mansion. Maria brought her along whenever she could. The girl explored every corner of the immense house, with unshakable curiosity. Ethan discovered he liked having her around. He liked the drawings she left scattered around the house. He liked the unexpected questions she asked. He liked the way she called him Uncle Ethan, with that natural intimacy only children possess. One afternoon he found her in the library, trying to reach a book on a high shelf. He got the book for her, and when Leah smiled and said thank you, Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was affection. It was that thing he had spent his entire life avoiding and that now, unexpectedly, was washing over him like a warm, comforting wave. 2 weeks after the visit to Richard Davis, Ethan called a press conference. It was a carefully orchestrated event. He rented a grand ballroom in a 5-star hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He invited all the major media outlets in the city, newspapers, magazines, television networks, news websites. He knew the story had all the elements the media loved: corporate scandal, historical injustice, redemption, human drama. And it had the Hayes name, which still carried weight in New York's business world. On the morning of the press conference, Ethan woke up early. He put on his best suit, but this time it wasn't to impress. It was to show respect. Respect for the truth he was about to tell. Respect for Joseph, who would be by his side on the stage. When he went down to the dining room, he found Joseph already awake, drinking coffee. The old man was wearing a suit Ethan had had custom made for him, simple but elegant. Joseph looked uncomfortable, tugging at his collar as if it were too tight. "Nervous?" Ethan asked. "Terrified," Joseph admitted. "It's been so long since I've spoken in public, so long since I've been in hiding, and now I'm going to expose myself to the whole country." Ethan placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "You're not alone. I'll be there. Maria will be there. And the truth will be there. That's all that matters." Joseph nodded, taking a deep breath. The hotel ballroom was packed when they arrived. Journalists filled every chair. Cameras were strategically positioned. Microphones were ready. There was a buzz of speculation. No one knew exactly what the press conference was about. The press releases had been deliberately vague. Ethan Hayes will make important revelations about the past of Hayes and Associates. The mystery had worked. Everyone wanted to know what the young heir to one of New York's largest real estate empires had to say. When Ethan walked onto the stage, accompanied by Joseph and the lawyers, the buzz ceased. Camera flashes exploded. Ethan approached the microphone, his hands gripping the sides of the lectern. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of expectant faces. He recognized some journalists, society columnists who used to write about him, his business deals, his few public appearances. He took a deep breath. "Good morning. My name is Ethan Hayes. I am the president of Hayes and Associates, a company founded by my father, Anthony Hayes, in 1982. I am here today to talk about something that happened in 1995, a scandal that many of you who have covered the industry for a long time may remember, a case of fraud and embezzlement that shook the company and resulted in the downfall of one man." He paused, looking at Joseph, an innocent man. The silence in the room was absolute. Every pen stopped writing. All eyes were fixed on him. For nearly 30 years, Joseph Miller has carried the weight of accusations that were not true. He was accused of embezzling money from the company, of forging documents, of betraying his employer's trust. He lost his job, his reputation, his dignity. He was forced to disappear because he could no longer live with the shame of something he did not commit. His family suffered. His daughter grew up carrying the stigma. His granddaughter never knew her grandfather. Ethan's voice began to crack, but he pushed on. And all of this happened because two people decided it was more convenient to destroy an innocent man than to admit the truth. He took a deep breath. This was the moment. There was no turning back. One of those people was Richard Davis, former operations manager at Hayes and Associates. He committed the fraud. He embezzled the money. He forged the documents. And then he used that money to start his own company, getting rich off the proceeds of his crime. Ethan paused again. The other person was my father, Anthony Hayes. A murmur rippled through the room. Journalists whispered among themselves. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every expression on Ethan's face. My father discovered what Richard had done. He had evidence. He had proof. He could have turned him over to the authorities, but he didn't. Instead, he made a deal. He would keep the secret in exchange for a share of the illicit profits, and to protect his own reputation, he allowed an innocent man to be sacrificed. The words were difficult to get out now. Joseph Miller was that man. And today, here, before all of you, before New York, before the country, I want to clear his name. Ethan turned and picked up a thick folder from the table. Here is the proof. Documents, recordings, emails, everything that confirms the involvement of Richard Davis and Anthony Hayes in the scheme. Everything that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Joseph Miller was innocent. This evidence is being delivered simultaneously to the district attorney's office and will be made available to the press. He invited Joseph to approach the microphone. The old man was pale, his hands shaking. But when he reached the lectern and looked out at that sea of faces, something inside him calmed. It was time to speak. It was time to be heard. My name is Joseph Miller, he began, his voice hoarse but firm. For 29 years I have lived like a ghost. I hid because I believed it was the only way to protect my family from the shame they pinned on me. Today, thanks to Ethan Hayes, I can finally tell the truth. I was innocent. I always was. And every day for nearly 3 decades I woke up knowing that but unable to prove it. Tears began to stream down his face. I lost years with my daughter. I never saw my granddaughter be born, grow up. I lost my wife, who fell ill from grief and passed away without me being able to say goodbye. All because of the greed of 2 men who chose the easy way out. He paused, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Maria, who was sitting in the front row, was crying openly. Several people in the audience also had moist eyes. But today, Joseph continued, today I get my name back, my story, my truth. And I thank Ethan for having the courage his father lacked, for choosing what was right over what was convenient, for giving me back something I thought I had lost forever, my dignity. The press conference lasted another 2 hours. Journalists asked questions. The lawyers presented more details. Ethan answered everything with complete transparency. When it finally ended and they left the hotel, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. Outside, the New York sky was clear, a rare sight in that city always covered by clouds and pollution. The sun shone bright and warm. Joseph looked up, closing his eyes, letting the light touch his face. It's over, he whispered. It's finally over. The fallout was immediate and massive. The story dominated every news broadcast that night. Newspapers dedicated entire pages to the case. News websites published detailed articles, timelines of the scandal, and interviews with experts debating the legal and ethical implications. The Hayes name, which for decades had been synonymous with business success, was now associated with fraud and injustice. But there was another side to it. Many praised Ethan's courage. They said he had shown more character in one day than his father had in a lifetime. They said it was rare to see someone with so much power choose truth over convenience. In the following days, Richard Davis was indicted. Even after so many years, the evidence was solid enough for the DA's office to open a case. He would certainly have to pay back money, face heavy fines. His reputation, which he had carefully built over decades, was destroyed. As for Anthony Hayes, his legacy was forever tarnished. The story would be told and retold, and he would be remembered not for the buildings he built, but for the innocent man he destroyed. Meanwhile, life went on differently at the mansion on the Upper East Side. Joseph had moved into one of the guest rooms, which Ethan insisted was now his room. Maria continued to work there, but the dynamic had completely changed. It was no longer employer and employee. It was something close to a makeshift family. They had dinner together. They talked late into the night. They laughed. Ethan discovered he liked having the house full of voices. He liked the sound of Leah's footsteps running through the hallways. He liked the smell of home-cooked food Maria made in the kitchen. He liked the stories Joseph told about the past, about his years in hiding, about the things he had learned. One Saturday afternoon, 3 months after the press conference, Ethan was in the mansion's garden. He had hired a landscaper to revitalize the space, which had been neglected for years. Now there were flowers, fruit trees, a small playground for Leah. He watched the girl on the swing, listening to her laughter as Joseph pushed her. Maria was sitting on a nearby bench, smiling. It was such a simple, ordinary scene. But for Ethan, it was everything. "Uncle Ethan," Leah called out, "come play with us." He hesitated. He had never played, not even as a child. He didn't know how. But Leah insisted, and he found himself walking over to the adjacent swing and sitting down. It was too small for him. His long legs barely fit. Joseph laughed and started pushing him too. And there, on that sunny Saturday afternoon, Ethan Hayes, 43 years old, billionaire, president of a development company, swung next to a 10-year-old girl. And for the first time in decades, he felt something he had forgotten: pure, simple happiness. In the following months, Ethan established the Joseph Miller Institute, an organization dedicated to supporting wrongfully accused workers, offering free legal aid, and fighting for labor law reform. He donated a significant amount of his own wealth to the initial fund. Joseph was put in charge of chairing the board, bringing his experience and his story as a symbol. Maria was hired as the administrative coordinator, finally getting a chance to use her intelligence and determination in a job that meant something. And Leah received a full scholarship to one of New York's best private schools, with everything paid for through university. But more than money, more than recognition, what really changed was something intangible. Joseph started smiling again. The wrinkles on his face, which were once just marks of suffering, were now also lines of joy. He walked the streets of New York with his head held high, no longer afraid of being recognized. In fact, when he was recognized, people would come to shake his hand, tell him they believed him, apologize for ever doubting him. Maria no longer carried the weight of family shame. For the first time in her life, she could speak of her father with pride. And Leah was growing up knowing her grandfather was a hero, a man who survived a terrible injustice and still didn't lose his kindness. As for Ethan, he discovered something he never thought possible. He was capable of love. Not romantic love, not yet. But love nonetheless. Love for the family he had adopted. Love for the little girl who called him uncle. Love for the old man who had taught him that integrity was worth more than any fortune. For the first time, the mansion wasn't just a structure of stone and glass. It was a home. One evening, 6 months after the press conference, Ethan was in his office when Leah knocked on the door. She came in holding something in her hands. It was a drawing. It showed 4 people in a room sitting around a table eating together. There were colorful plates, glasses, flowers in the center, and everyone was smiling. Underneath, in neat letters, she had written, "My family." "It's for you," Leah said, handing him the drawing. Ethan took it carefully, feeling his eyes sting. "Can I put it on the wall?" "Of course, but there's a little space there for you to sign too. Everyone in the family has to sign." He looked and saw that she had left space in the bottom corner for signatures. There were already 3, Leah Miller, Maria Miller, Joseph Miller. Ethan picked up a pen and with a trembling hand wrote his name under the others. Ethan Hayes, part of the Miller family. And for the first time, that last name he had carried with so much weight and pride seemed less important than the simple connection of people who cared about each other. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Ethan stood in the library looking at the framed drawing now on the wall. He thought about everything that had happened. He thought about how an old watch and a curious little girl had completely changed the course of his life. He thought about how he had almost lost the chance to be human, to feel, to truly live. And he gave a silent thanks for that Tuesday morning when a housekeeper arrived at his door with her daughter. That morning, that had seemed like an inconvenience and ended up being a salvation. He picked up his phone and called Roger, the investigator who had started it all. "Roger, it's me. I have another job for you." "Go ahead, Ethan. What do you need?" "I need you to investigate cases of workplace injustice from the last 20 years. Cases where workers were falsely accused, had their lives destroyed. I want to do for as many people as possible what I did for Joseph. I want to clear names. I want to restore dignity." There was a pause on the other end. Then Roger said, "That's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be expensive. It's going to take years." "I know, and I have time, and I have money, and more importantly, I have a purpose." Ethan smiled. "Send me the bill, and don't worry about the cost. The only thing that matters is doing the right thing." When he hung up, Ethan looked out the window. Outside, New York glittered with millions of lights. A huge city full of stories, of injustices, of pain, but also full of possibilities, full of chances to do things differently, to do better. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't fix every injustice, but he could try. He could use his privilege, his money, his position to do something that mattered, and that was exactly what he was going to do. 2 years passed. The Joseph Miller Institute grew, helped hundreds of families, cleared dozens of unjustly tarnished names. Hayes and Associates was completely restructured with new policies of transparency and ethics. Some major clients left, uncomfortable with the scandal, but new clients came, attracted precisely by the change in posture. The company was no longer the biggest in the industry, but it was respected. And for Ethan, that was worth infinitely more. Leah was 12 now, growing up fast and smart. She got excellent grades in school, dreamed of becoming a lawyer to help people like her grandpa. Joseph, at 73, had regained years of his life. His health had improved with the end of chronic stress. He traveled the country giving talks on resilience, on justice, on forgiveness. Maria had gone back to school taking business administration courses at night, determined to develop herself. And on weekends, they all gathered at the mansion for dinners that lasted late into the night, filled with conversation, laughter, and plans for the future. Once, during one of these dinners, Joseph raised his wine glass and made a toast. "To the families we choose, to second chances, and to a man who had the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard." Everyone raised their glasses. Leah, with her glass of juice, smiled at Ethan. "Grandpa's talking about you, Uncle Ethan." Ethan felt the familiar tightness in his chest, that emotion that still caught him off guard sometimes. "I just did what any decent person would do." "No," Joseph said seriously. "You did what few would have the courage to do. You chose truth over comfort. You chose justice over blind loyalty. And that makes all the difference." That night, after everyone had left and the house had returned to silence, Ethan went up to the attic. It was a place he rarely visited since that night he found the photo, but today he felt he needed to go back. He turned on the light and walked among the dusty boxes until he found what he was looking for. It was an old picture frame with a photo of him when he was 5. He was on his mother's lap, and his father was beside them, a hand on her shoulder. No one was smiling in the photo. It was just a record, proof that they had existed together, not that they had been happy together. Ethan looked at that photo for a long moment. He tried to feel something, longing, anger, sadness, but all he felt was emptiness. Those people in the photo were strangers. He didn't really know them, and they didn't know him. He put the photo back in the box and closed it. Not with anger, not with resentment, just acceptance. That chapter was closed. He went downstairs and passed through the library. He stopped in front of the wall where there were now a dozen of Leah's drawings, all framed, all showing different moments of their life together. There was the drawing of the family at the table, the drawing of the day they went to the park, the drawing of Joseph's birthday, the drawing of Maria's graduation, a gallery of happy, simple, real memories. And there, in the center of them all, was still the first drawing, the one of the house with all the lights on. Ethan moved closer and read the signature in the corner, his name alongside the others. A family that didn't share blood, but shared something stronger. Chosen love, earned love, real love. That night, for the first time in a long time, Ethan dreamed. They weren't the confusing, restless dreams he used to have. It was something peaceful. He dreamed. He was in a huge garden, full of flowers that didn't exist anywhere, in colors he had never seen. And in that garden were all the people he had helped. Joseph was there, Maria, Leah. But there were others too. Dozens of other people the Institute had supported, families reunited, names cleared, lives rebuilt, everyone smiling, everyone at peace. And when he woke up, it was still night, but Ethan didn't feel the familiar loneliness that had always accompanied him. He felt something different. He felt that he wasn't alone, that he would never be alone again. The watch. That started it all was still with Leah. She wore it every day now, even though it was too big for her thin wrist. She said that one day she would pass it on to her own children. She would tell the story of how a simple object connected people, how it revealed truths, how it changed lives, and how it proved that sometimes, just sometimes, justice was still possible. Ethan Hayes was no longer the cold, distant man who had woken up on that Tuesday months ago. He had learned to feel. He had learned to love. He had learned that wealth without purpose was just numbers in an account. But wealth with purpose, with intention, with heart, could change the world. One cleared name at a time. One reunited family at a time. One rebuilt life at a time. And every night before he went to sleep, he would look at the drawing on the wall and whisper a silent gratitude. Gratitude for that curious little girl who recognized a watch. Gratitude for that brave mother who dared to speak the truth. Gratitude for that resilient man who survived the impossible. But most of all, gratitude for having had the chance to do things differently, to choose right, to be finally human. The mansion on the Upper East Side was no longer a museum. It was a home. And Ethan was no longer a statue of ice. He was a man with a heart, a man with a family, a man who after 43 years of merely existing had finally learned how to live. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ethan, Joseph, Maria, and Leah has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of redemption, justice, and love, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. This story teaches us that it's never too late to do the right thing, that families are built with love and not just blood, and that a single courageous choice can change lives forever. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest and truest side of the human soul. We'll see you in the next episode, where more emotions and life lessons await.